Hello, once again, and welcome to our very, very mercurial show, Bonga Futaa. Now, you know, this is a show that tells you about what's going on in Kenyan football. It's not about the results on the field alone. It's about what else is going on behind the scenes. A lot has been said about Kenyan soccer. A lot has been said about what's going on, back and forth. So much information. Oh, this team is the best. Oh, Mathare United has the best, the best system of bringing in players. Oh, Western Stima is decimated. Gor Mahia is losing players. There is so much going on. What we do is we put you in the picture by looking for those people to talk to them. But let's start somewhere at the beginning. See this ball here? This is called the Juala ball. A lot of players started from here, not just in Kenya, even in Brazil, even in Argentina, where soccer lives. They started from here. It gives them the hope. They build it from there into bigger pictures of football. That has happened, and especially at Mathare United. Today, we will be talking to Bob Munro, the man who's said to have started it all at Mathare Youth Sports Association. Many things are said about Bob Munro. Good things, bad things, many things. But it's always nicest to hear it from the man himself. Thank you very much, Bob, for joining us.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Good to be here with both of you again.
You are talked about in a lot of awe by what you have done for Mathare Youth Sports Association. But you're talked about again as the person who is eating it all on Mathare United. What's your take? Where are we at the moment in Kenyan football and with Mathare Youth Sports Association?
Eating it all. I didn't know it showed. Eating is something I haven't done, as you know, in football. Unfortunately, a lot of other people have eaten, my life took a strange diversion, an unlikely diversion, because I'm an ice hockey player. Soccer wasn't known when I was growing up in the 50s in Canada. We played real football, where you could pick up and run with it without getting a red card. But in Mathare, when we started, I promised them, I made a deal with them of if you do something, I'll do something, and if you do nothing, I'll do nothing. And what they wanted to do was play football. And ice hockey isn't really an option here. No, not until recently, at least.
Not
no, we have a national ice hockey team now.
We do. We have a team there. I know where they train as well. But are you happy with what you have done as per what your objective of setting this up was? And are you happy with what's going on in football in Kenya at the national level, the club level, where again you have been very instrumental?
Yes and no.
Let's start with yes.
Yes, well, when you look at, MISA now has over 130,000 alumni. And that's, what MISA really is about is not all the trophies in the cabinet, although when they get a chance to try for one, they go for it. But you've been to the MISA headquarters and seen the number of trophies we have, hundreds of trophies. But that's not our biggest achievement. Our biggest achievement by far is creating new heroes and role models.
And you've done that. There are very many. I mean, you can't go to any corner of the world and not find a MISA alumni. And we had Mathare United here as well. But people said that this was the best organized outfit in terms of football, in terms of a feeder program, right from the lower ranks into middle ages, into ripe ages for playing football abroad. Does that still resonate as your idea and your objective and achieved?
Yeah, the football is, MISA is a development project using football as the starting point. That's the core, that's the essence of MISA. And from there, they can get involved in the AIDS prevention, get involved in anti-child labor, gender violence issues. We have 4 libraries and especially the garbage cleanups as well, which is a major factor. So that culture in Mathare, the resilience of the youth and their mothers and the people in Mathare, that resilience, but also the ability to share.
Okay.
And that's what MISA is building on.
Let me
as
bring
well.
you back now. A good introduction on what's going on at MISA, but let's talk about this Juala football and especially football in itself.
Yes.
You were very instrumental into setting up what is called the Kenyan Premier League. Many people learned later they weren't interested. It's a company. Where are we in Kenyan football according to what you wanted it to be? Where are we at the moment?
Well, I've been involved in football now for over 30 years. But I think even if you go back to the origins of football or at independence, we're probably in the darkest days of football in Kenya right now.
Why?
It's not all due to COVID, but of course COVID it was the critical turning point and the critical factor. But let me give an example. What MISA is all about and what KPL was all about is the power of football, to do good in the lives of the players and their families, help them have a livelihood, help them get out of the slums, help them escape poverty. And the KPL had only been going, we started in 2003 as a private company, but in 2008 we had the post-election violence. And when we had a World Cup qualifier coming up in June. So the government in March announced that we don't have funds. We have all these IDPs that we have to care for, and rightly so, and that they get priority. But then FKF in April said they didn't have funds to fund the qualifier either, without explaining why they didn't have funds. And so this is one of my proudest moments in sport, was I was then chairing KPL, and I convened a meeting in early May of all the chairmen, and I assure you, it didn't take more than 5-10 minutes. I made an introduction about how in this period, with a lot of ethnic violence and that going on as well, we needed a neutral force, or a force for good. And that was the Kenyan Premier League and the national teams. When the national team is playing, you don't have Luos and Luyas and Akambas in the stadium. You only have Kenyans in the stadium. So I made that introduction, but within no longer than 10 minutes, everybody agreed. And remember, we had just got the Super Sport money for the first year. And all the clubs were trying to recover. And what happened? We funded the national team that year. And it's never happened before and since in the history of FIFA, because I checked with them, that the top clubs have funded the national team. And remember that year we went from 120 in the world to our highest ranking ever, 68th in the world within 5 months. And it had a major impact. Now we come to today.
So you'd say the KPL at that time funded the national team, but what's going on now?
That's why I think it's the darkest days, because what COVID has done has created a split among the clubs as well. Because since March we haven't been playing and we don't have any income. And so you now have 4 or 5 rich clubs and a dozen clubs who are on the brink of financial collapse, including my own club.
When you say the rich clubs, you're referring to the institutional clubs?
They're not all institutional.
They're not all institutional.
It's Wazito isn't an institutional club, but you also have Tusker, and you have Ulinzi, and you have Bandari. Sofapaka is in and out of that
You've
group
got
as well.
KCB as well?
And KCB. So it's largely institutional, yes. You're right on that, but not entirely.
Not entirely.
But then you have the rest of us. Now what's happened is, and this is what saddens me the most these days, the image that I get is the image of these wildlife films, where you have a pride of lions stalking a herd of zebras, and they look for the most vulnerable, the weakest, and then they pounce. And that's what's happening. You can see it even in today's newspapers. The number of players, they're using the COVID crisis, and instead of being a force for good in the country, in helping the country get through the COVID crisis and the recovery period, it's just predators versus prey.
You're talking about the loophole in, well, not the loophole, but the clause in terms of if you're not paid for 3 months, you can leave the club. And so many other clubs are
2 months.
Is it 2 months?
Yeah, it's 2 months.
It's an even shorter time.
2
So
consecutive months.
I think we were having that discussion with Ghost earlier, and I think it's, did you want to ask something about funding, I think?
Yeah, I mean, KPL at one time was very organized, has so much money. What has happened at the moment that KPL cannot be able maybe to fund the clubs?
In the big picture, there's a lot of things that are not going right. So the situation of the clubs these days, today, the majority of clubs, 2/3 of the Kenyan Premier League clubs, on the brink of collapse. I don't see and hear the players' union standing up and speaking out, or putting pressure on government, or the referees association, or the coaches association. I don't see the KPL leaders, the executive committee and directors, speaking out about the plight of the players, because they're really desperate, the players and their families. Players getting locked out. So, and I don't see the FKF leadership also speaking out on that. I mean, you can't play the sport without the players.
As KPL, I think there is a sports fund which I think is running right now. Have you guys tried to maybe ask for the sports funding?
You know how to push the right buttons and the right triggers. The sports fund. Okay, let's talk about the sports fund for a minute, because it hasn't stepped up either. Now, in The Nation on May 18th, there was an article on announcing, the headline was, in the month of May 2019, the betting volume was 30 billion a month. 30 billion. Now, if you take, because it's a very elaborate, they're paying corporate taxes, they're paying, what's it called? It's not a windfall tax, but on the tax on the winnings that they have in that.
Yes.
But still, if that's 35% in total, 15 and 20%. But then that's not on the 30 billion, that's on a smaller amount. That's on the amount they have to pay after writing off expenses and everything. But still, by any reasonable estimate, if you're having 30 billion a month, you must be, at least 3 or 4 billion of that must be paid in taxes as a minimum. And in a year, that's 50 million shillings. And if a third of that is supposed to be going to sport, then that's 10 to 15 billion shillings in 2019 alone. And I've been trying to ask the question and talk to journalists and that, who also have been asking questions about what is the money in the sports fund. Because there was, you remember in 2018, the sports fund was set up and it was run by largely sports people. And then there was, I don't want to call it a hostile takeover, but it was sort of a hostile takeover from a sports point of view.
Yes.
It was a hostile takeover by the Treasury Department. And then all of a sudden, it was 65% for social development. It was sports, art, and social development. 60% for social development. Then it was 35% for sport, 10% for arts, and 5% for what they called strategic cabinet decisions. Do your math. That adds up to 120%. How can you have 120%?
I was just doing that calculation. And
Exactly.
You had already surpassed the 100% mark.
Then
The question that Ghost is asking is, then, has KPL in its entity as the football body gone to ask for it, either from the ministry or from the government directly, or what is the procedure of trying to find out how this can trickle down to football?
I can only speak for myself. I have tried with the ministry at the highest levels.
Yes. And what did they tell
for
you?
several months. But I'm not aware of anything that KPL has done or that FKF has done. But I'd like to stay on the sports fund just for a minute, though, is that when you look at that, what may have happened is social development took its 60%, arts took its 10, and strategic cabinet decisions took its 5. That's 85. That only leaves 15% for sports. So did that happen? You know, did sport get its 35% in 2019? That's a big question, and nobody can answer that question for me or is willing to answer that question. But if you assume that sport got 35, then we're talking about at least 10 to 15 billion in the sports fund by the end of the year. And what was spent last year? 245 for AFCON, 450 million to motorsport, and 1 billion for moving those dubious medical clinic containers. 1 billion.
Okay,
so
you're talking about misappropriation of probably some of those funds. The bigger question is then, because it's meant to benefit the players.
Exactly.
Would you then root maybe for a stimulus package for the players? Because I see the mathematics, and I see the mathematics is not favorable to football. What would you root for? A government of Kenya stimulus package? What are the challenges if that was to be rooted for to help football?
Well, the question is, what are the choices for football clubs? And there aren't any anymore. There's no. Are any companies in Kenya, apart from perhaps betting companies and Safaricom, are any companies going to be maintaining their marketing budgets and their CSR programs for the next 1 to 2 years? Are there going to be any sponsorships available in Kenya in the next 1 to 2 years? It's highly unlikely. So what are you left with? You're left with government. Do they want a Premier League or not? That's the issue. So when you say a stimulus package, let's focus on that for a minute. In late May, the announcement was made, 20 million to the Kenyan Premier League. 35 on each team. Now that's an issue. We'll come back to it in a minute. 30 players, 5 officials from each club. 12 clubs, the 12 most vulnerable clubs. You do the math. You're talking about 420. 10,000 a month for 3 months. So each month is 4.2 million, right?
Yep.
Times 3 months is 12.5 million. Where's the other 7.5 out of the 20 that's supposed to go to KPL? And on top of that, what's actually happened? The first 10,000 was paid in late May, early June. The 10,000 for July wasn't paid until late July. So in fact, the sports fund, the stimulus package, out of the 12 million for 3 months, they probably haven't spent more than 6 million out of 20 million that they said was going to be the total package.
We are even having an issue with what has already been said to have been used.
Yes.
It's not adding up.
It's not only adding up in terms of volume, but when you look at, now, it's not nice to say, no to any money, and especially when you're a poor club. So 10,000 a month. First of all, 30 players and 5 officials. Every team has at least 10 officials, technical bench and officials. Who makes the judgment on who gets it and who doesn't get the 10,000? Then you have the issue of one size fits all. A junior player is making X amount. A veteran player is making 2 to 3 times that. And a coach, a senior coach, is making 4 to 5 times that. And they all get 10,000. One size fits all. Then you look at the players. I've been living with these issues for six months now, so that's why I'm so passionate about it. Yeah. So 10,000. 10,000 is the rent of a junior player, an unmarried junior player. A more veteran player with a wife and a couple of kids, his rent's going to be 25,000 a month, at least 20 to 25,000 a month. And a coach, a senior coach or a technical bench, they're going to be paying 40 to 50,000 a month. And the stimulus package is 10 to everybody, same amount to everybody. And it's not paid on time either.
Could we say, Bob, that this is disrespect to sports in this country, or especially to football?
let me put it, yes, yeah, I agree with your statement. And I would also say, though, it raises big questions of, we're talking about last year, the only known public expenditure on sport was about 750 million. Sorry, it was 750,000
Yes.
that was spent on sport, and we know from what I said earlier, there must be at least, there should have been 10 to 15 billion there, and why isn't it being used for the real situation, which is players and their families suffering and being evicted and not having enough money for food, never mind having enough money for their medical protection and face masks and medical appointments and that. So the situation is really desperate. And here I have to question the media. Why, in the last 6 months, how many media stories have you read about the increasingly desperate plight of the players and their families?
Yeah, I think we've
You didn't
expanded
answer my question.
well on financial crisis and all that. Maybe you'd like us to, before we take a break, maybe just expand a little bit on that, on what you think then should happen. We know clubs, we know players, we know facilities are suffering as well because of the absence of money, but the extent has not been quantified yet. I want your opinion on that. Plus then what you think about the latest recommendations for resumption of sports in the country and whether they are workable in football. Let's deal with that and then go into a break and come back and talk about this agreement between KPL and FKF that is not understandable at the moment. No one's moving, no one's coming back, no one's going anywhere, and football is not moving. We'll talk about that as well. But first, COVID and facilities and financial crisis and the recommendations for resumption.
You use the word workable. It's not an issue, I think, of being workable. It's an issue of being necessary. You know, you just can't put the players and their families and fans and that at risk, and youth, like in MISA. MISA has not had any operational activities since early March. But what I didn't see in the guidelines was, where do you test? How quickly do you get your test results? How much is it going to cost you to test every player? How frequently have to, because testing is going down in Kenya, isn't it? And now they're coming saying, now all of you have to meet these requirements. And I agree with those requirements. Those are international standard requirements now, and we have lots of case studies in that I'm sure they benefited from Europe, of this gradual opening. But there are all these issues still of testing capacity, testing costs. If it's
on the players as well.
If it's 5,000 to 8,000 for a test, and you have 40 officials, and then there's a requirement that in the first stage you can only have 10 officials or 10 participants in the training. How do you do that? How do you apply that on a football team? It's when you have 10 officials who are at most trainings. And you're not adding the players. So
you've not brought in the players. But you have to separate them as well in the transport. So that there's spacing, even in the transport. You need 2 buses to bring the players. They hardly have 1 bus. So that's why I said workable. I use the term workable. But
but let's tie the 2 things together.
Yes.
How do you make sure those necessary requirements are met with 12 of the 18 clubs absolutely broke and owing anywhere from 2 to 6 months in salaries to their players? How do you do that?
So we're in deep trouble. That's what you're saying.
Yes, darkest days.
Darkest days.
Yeah, in football.
All right.
And that's why I'm sad that not unlike in 2008, that the Kenyan Premier League is no longer united as a group of clubs. I think frankly, I think some of those chairmen and clubs should be ashamed of themselves. The way they're exploiting the COVID crisis to poach players for free by invoking the FIFA clause. And how are we? If we could start 3 weeks from now, most of the clubs in the Kenyan Premier League and most of the players who haven't been eating well, they've been exercising, but they haven't been eating well, there's no way that they can reasonably start, because their financial health as a player and as a club are so poor.
Okay, there will be hard hit. That's
Yeah.
for sure.
They are hard hit.
They are hard hit,
Yeah.
and so the Premier League will be hard hit as well, even if we came
Exactly.
back in terms of
Exactly.
standards and everything. Okay, we'll talk a little bit more of that when we come back, but I also would like us to go into this pertinent issue. We're going into elections at the moment, or we are not going into elections. We are in court, or we are not allowed to go in court because it's football. We are going into a transition between KPL and FKF, or maybe there will be no transition. I really would like us to put us in the picture of this as well. So when we come back, that's one of the issues we'll be tackling at the moment. We're talking to Bob Munro. You know the name. It's been there in football. It's associated with Mathare Youth Sports Association, Mathare United. Remember one time we had 2 Mathare Uniteds in the Kenyan Premier League. That was a first and historical as well. So he's the right person to talk about what's going on. He was deep in the sponsorship of Kenyan Premier League with SuperSport. So he knows matters money as well, and you've heard them. We want to talk about that transition from one to the other, if it will happen, when we come back after the break. Welcome back to Bonga Futaa. We left it at a point in which we were doing a lot of mathematics. I'm sure you've done your calculations, and you are perplexed by the number of zeros you have to put behind figures to make a billion. And we're talking about lots of billions of money. We've talked about what is there in the sports fund, what is needed even in the government of Kenya stimulus, what KPL needs, how much money really is needed to be able to put things back if they were to go back. But the big question is, where is that money that we are calculating? Well, we won't finger out exactly where it is, but we'll talk about where maybe it should have been coming from, or where it should be at the moment. Bernardo Tieno, I'm in the company of Jacob Gosmule, and we've delved into the crisis in Kenya, but we have another crisis, Jacob. I don't know if I can call it a crisis.
Well, maybe Bob will be able to expound on that. I mean, KPL right now and FKF, we've been reading that the agreement is coming to an end in somewhere in September. What is the position at the moment? Where are we and where are we going from here?
The D-Day is September 24th, precisely.
Yes.
I'm rather disturbed by the recent events. The good news is that a sponsor has come in, although there are questions being raised about it, but the sponsor has come in, and the clubs have got a bit of money from that, and that's helped the families. But I'm worried about some of the contradictions that are coming forward. For example, the FKF president has publicly and repeatedly stated that he thinks the idea that whoever wins the league before becomes the chairman of KPL. The reason, because I helped draft that, the reason for that was to keep the politics, try to reduce the politics in football, because as soon as you have an elected leader in KPL, then you have 2 elected leaders in football. And if they're not on the same page, then you have a war going on. It's even worse.
Between if you elected someone in KPL and then there's somebody elected in FKF,
exactly,
there would be a
like
clash.
you see in South Africa.
It would be actually a contradiction.
Yeah, you see that in South Africa between the SPL and the FA, but this is being so. He says the KPL chairman can't be neutral because he's from a club, but the person who's saying it is the FKF president who owns a club. So there is a certain contradiction there that some people are more neutral than others, it seems. But there's also the contradiction of we're not going to change anything. So if you're not going to change anything, then why not just renew the agreement?
What's the position of the agreement? What's on the agreement? Is it meant to be renewed? Is it terminated? Is there a clause for renegotiating it, or is it what's in the agreement?
Well,
itself?
it's a fairly standard agreement, and yes, you can renegotiate it, but the FKF president has made it very clear that he's not interested in negotiations. And one of the key things in that agreement is the Joint Executive Committee, which even FIFA admired it because they didn't see it elsewhere in the world. where you have a committee of the FKF president, the chairman of KPL, 2 of the members of their executive committees, and the 2 CEOs. And it's basically a firefighting committee to get away from, and we put it in place in 2012 when Sam Nyamwe became the president, and put it in place, and he and I had discussed it, because all the wrangles that had been the previous decade have said, look, instead of having these media wars, fighting each other during the media, why don't we just deal with the problems? So let's set up this committee that either chairman can convene it at any time, basically on 24 hours notice, calls the other one, we have this problem. So we'd meet at 7 at a hotel, meet at 7 o'clock in the morning and finish by 9, because everybody else had their other appointments. And that firefighting committee, this issue has come up, we've got to deal with it now, and we found a solution and we moved on. So you remember that period, 2012, 2014, 15, there were no media wars or wrangles going on. But it's there, but I think there's only been 3 meetings of the JAC in the last 4 years, and the last one was over 3 years ago. So no wonder we're getting these wrangles and that again, because we don't sit down as colleagues and in the same industry.
So when was the JSC abolished, or did this just fade a natural death? What happened?
It was ignored. That's the polite way of saying it. That one of the parties didn't like the idea of sitting down and discussing and finding solutions together.
But right now there is another committee that has been formed for exactly that purpose,
Well,
to
that's-
try and bridge this gap between, to try and provide a safe bridge to cross from one to the other. Isn't it listening to both sides? And what's the
Well,
challenge?
that's a third contradiction. You'll be completely independent. And what is the first thing that he does is basically say, we will completely ignore the existing structure, because we're a private company and we have a chairman and we have an executive committee and we have a governing council. We'll ignore all that and we'll have a few people that I feel comfortable with to sit down and discuss. But on that group of 5, one is the FKF lawyer and another one is from the club he owns. Now, I'm not casting aspersion on those people. I'm just saying it doesn't make sense that that there's a contradiction between what is being said and what is actually being done. And so I'm sad that the KPL is basically, the majority of clubs are basically sidelined in this whole process. Why, if you wanted to have a joint meeting, why not just convene a meeting of the JAC?
Bob, if you were leading this discussion for, I don't know whether to call it transition, I don't know what it's being called, but I know it's to bridge from one to the other. What would be the content that you are discussing? What are you talking about? Monies? Are you talking about handing over equipment? What would you be discussing in that committee?
Well, if I was leading it, I would say, let's take the agreement and go through it. And what do you agree with and what don't you agree with? And let's discuss those outstanding issues. Because I think the agreement is quite comprehensive, and I particularly think the Joint Executive Committee was the key. And why can't the Joint Executive Committee simply meet and resolve the problems in the agreement? So I don't understand why this, if you don't intend to change it, then why not renew it? And if you do want to change it, why not sit down and discuss what those changes are going to be? But there's also another factor here which isn't taken properly into account, is that KPL is a private company with shareholders, and the clubs are the shareholders. Now you have to ask yourself, and we're affiliated to FKF, you have to ask yourself, what benefits do we, the clubs, get from our affiliation with FKF? What do we get? We pay the money for the affiliation. It's a one-way transfer of money. But what do we get? Well, there's only one thing that we really get, and that's recognition by FIFA through FKF, so that our clubs and our national team can participate, so our clubs can participate in international competitions, CAF competitions. But how many KPL clubs can afford to participate in them? There's only 3 or 4. So if you had a vote in the KPL on if the agreement ends and there's no new agreement, then do we affiliate with FKF, or do we, as we have done before, as none of us have money to participate in CAF anyway, what's the benefit? So the other option is we go on as the Kenyan Premier League until the other side is willing to sit down and have a frank discussion between partners, not between enemies, but between partners in the same industry.
I am getting a feeling that I got about 6 or 7 years back
Yes.
when this happened again, and the clubs were in KPL, and there are things they couldn't do outside the country. There are things that could only be done in here. The national team could not do some things here, even with sponsorship, could do some things outside. Are we going back to those days where clubs will do their own thing and the federation does its own thing? You've talked about it being a company.
I would
they can't
hope,
bulldoze the
yeah,
company.
yeah.
But are you foreseeing a situation where the clubs will decide we are going to do our thing?
All I'm saying is I'm just looking at the numbers and saying in the KPL, if that becomes an issue, the majority of clubs don't see any benefit that benefits them as clubs. 12 of the 16 or 15 of the 18 rather, the majority don't see the benefit of that. That's not a benefit. We can't afford to participate in it anyway, so why don't we clean up our house and move on? I'm not advocating it. What I'm saying, my main point is we should be sitting down as partners, not on a basis of one partner dictating what the terms are going to be and how the future is going to look. But right now, that partner has the power of the purse.
Your clubs have accepted the sponsorship. They have accepted money from FKF. Does it mean that you are agreeing on one part and you're not agreeing on another?
You know the situation. We've described it earlier in the interview. What club can say no these days? If your players and their families are really suffering, you can't say no. Now, the difference then is, does the sponsorship money go via FKF to KPL, or does it go directly to KPL?
The other side is this money coming through KPL to the clubs or going through FKF? Because that's another thing to consider as well.
Exactly.
But you're bringing in a very interesting aspect here. Like I told you, I'm getting this feeling of a couple of years back. FIFA versus FKF versus KPL. First, there are few cases that have been lodged in several courts in the country regarding what is going on at the moment, and more so the elections, which we'll talk about in a little while. But there's always the constant threat of a ban on Kenya if you go to courts. What is the stand? What goes on here? What is the worst that could happen if you went to court? Because if you're aggrieved, you go to court. But we also have the Sports Disputes Tribunal. What's going on between these three arms? The Federation, the Sports Dispute Tribunal, and going to courts, and FIFA.
Yes, well, I had a lot of hopes for the Sports Tribunal, but one of their first major decisions was the expansion of the league, not based on any professional football grounds, but basically on that it was an election promise and that this has to happen. And I was surprised and disappointed that the court made a decision which contradicted itself. At the beginning it says KPL has full management authority, and then at the end says, oh, by the way, it doesn't. And the FKF president has the right to expand the league. I don't see that in the agreement we have. And so I was surprised and disappointed. And that's one of the things that then hit all the clubs, because all of our costs went up. And we didn't get anything close to compensation for the additional costs for that court decision. And then we get hit last year by an arbitrary decision to play a whole season within 6 months, December 2018 to
Yeah, almost combining 2 seasons. Yes.
yeah, it was a season and a half we had to play in 2019. Now, clubs like Sony, which was having financial problems, the company itself, they're not going to increase the budget. And Sony was already struggling, as was my club, struggling for 1 season, 1 year, same budget. And now we have to do so by the middle of last year, most of the clubs we're talking about that are vulnerable now were already in financial difficulties then. And then when COVID hit us, so this issue of the clubs and their financial collapse is not because of mismanagement in clubs, it's because of bad decisions in football management. Now on the courts, that's also a disappointment. These issues have been going on, and rulings are made by the Sports Dispute Tribunal, which are ignored with impunity so far. That's one set of issues. The other set of issue, though, is FIFA versus government issue, and that I'm very unhappy and very concerned about the double standards and hypocrisy of FIFA. Because, for example, in the last 4 years, the Swiss authorities have raided the FIFA headquarters in Zurich. They've seized files, they've seized computer disks, they've started investigations. And yet, I have yet to hear of FIFA threatening to ban the Swiss national team due to government interference in football.
Or the Swiss Federation, for that matter.
Yes, exactly. So,
Well, yeah,
so there's one rule for the UEFA countries and one rule for the rest of us, and it's a double standard and shouldn't be allowed to go on. Now, when you look at the case subjectively, FIFA is an international NGO located in Switzerland. It has no international authority. You know, it's not like an embassy or a UN agency. It's not territorial. That's why the Swiss can go in and seize their files. And let me take an extreme case. An FA president, in public view, murders somebody on the streets in their country. Now, if you prosecute them for murder, is that government interference in football?
No.
No. So it's clear, that example makes clear that if you have a clash between the statutes of an international NGO and the laws of the country in which they're living or have members, there's no question that the citizens of that country have to respect their own laws and courts. And if they don't, then there are consequences, serious consequences. So so it's not coincidental that two of the biggest cases right now on FIFA and versus government is Kenya and Trinidad and Tobago. Trinidad and Tobago, they have an elected office, they're in office for 3 months. FIFA was friendly to the ones they displaced. FIFA then basically disbands the elected officials and sets up a normalization committee. And now it's a court case, and a decision has been made in a Trinidad court that FIFA is interfering. It's not government interference in good governance. It's now FIFA interference in good governance. Okay, so
Jacob, I need to ask you this as well. You've had so many times, you know, this threat that you're going to be banned. You're going to be banned by FIFA. How big is this threat? How real is this threat? Now that Bob is telling us that, you know, it probably should not interfere with the laws of the country. What have you had?
Well, I think the latest case was Sierra Leone, just before the last edition of the Cup of Nations. But coming to our case, I think I'm also at a loss because the Sports Dispute Tribunal, they made their ruling. Then FIFA also has their own ruling. So it's a bit confusing to to me, because I don't really understand where we stand, and an election also is coming. So it's a case of really not knowing who has the express authority to run football in a particular situation.
And in a particular country. Yeah.
You notice the contrast between the two examples. In Trinidad and Tobago, FIFA imposed a normalization committee, and that's what's being fought in the court. In Kenya, so they're fighting because FIFA imposed a normalization committee. In Kenya, we asked FIFA to set up a normalization committee, and they refused. Two cases going on at the same time.
Two contrasts.
Two contrasts.
If you were asked to give a way forward, what would you say? That the local federation should be allowed to run football according to also the laws of their country, with FIFA just playing an oversight role at the international level?
No, I think there needs to be, now it's coming down to FIFA has to rethink its judicial system as well in accordance with national law. You cannot tell a citizen because they are a member of your FA member that you have to ignore the courts and the laws and the constitution of your own country. Now we have to start refining and saying, okay, FIFA, if there's widespread corruption, that's a concern of both FIFA and the government. Okay. And that's where FIFA and the government should be coming together on these things, not going along separate paths.
Bob, I want to drag you into some of the politics of football in this country.
No.
We must get into it. We cannot avoid it. We are going into elections.
Yes.
What's your comment? And I'll leave it open for you to tell us what's your comment on the elections. Should we not? Is it time? Is it a priority? What do you think about the elections at the moment? With what you've read, what you have heard?
So you want me charged with contempt of court as well?
This is your opinion.
There's no question in my mind that the Constitution and the laws and the courts of Kenya are supreme and superior to FIFA statutes, and so as Kenyans, we have the right to go to court on issues but we've set up a special sports tribunal to deal with that. Unhappily, I think its record there are some serious questions about its record so far. But I'm a fan of the Sports Dispute Tribunal. I think it was long needed, and I'm glad it's in place. On the elections, some of these legal cases and that are quite complicated. But at the end of the day, I think it's what the Sports Tribunal said earlier, is that the electoral code for FKF has to be in accordance with the Constitution of Kenya as well. And so I think there is a serious issue there that is still open. Is the present approach fair to all candidates equally? And I don't think it is. And that we need to sit down outside of court as well as inside. It's the same issue with the agreement on FKF and KPL agreement. We're partners in the same industry. We should be sitting down together, not one dictating to the other. You know, for example, where, especially for Chan, but the national team, where do the majority of players come from? They come from the Kenyan Premier League. And so we have been releasing our players for as much as a month or 5 weeks and sometimes 6 weeks some years ago in advance of a qualifying match, when in fact you only have to do it for 5 days, including the day of the match. So the KPL clubs have shown time and time again through its accepting these long releases, in spite of the fact that it undermines your club's performance if you have a lot of players who are training with the national team in 4 or 5 weeks. The KPL has certainly shown its goodwill and willingness to be part of this. But we need a partner who understands that and accepts that football can only succeed in Kenya if the top clubs and the FKF are working together, period. And
Bob, I have never heard you have such a conciliatory tone in talking about things at the moment, really wanting people to sit down together to work
of course,
for the good of the game.
What?
You know? It's really, it tells us a lot that you are not happy about what's going on, and you really wish that people could sit down at the table and discuss the way forward for the sport. That is hit me.
with mutual
Yeah,
respect.
With mutual respect.
And realize that one can't succeed without the other.
Okay.
The KPL can't succeed without a successful national team. The FKF can't succeed and have a successful national team without the cooperation of KPL. What's so hard to understand about that? You know, so it's people of goodwill and mutual respect who need to sit down and sort this out.
Okay.
We had it sorted out for 3 years. We had it sorted out with the Joint Executive Committee. And why it's not being utilized now is a big question mark.
All right. Jacob, I don't know if you recognize this, the Laurea's Sports for Good Award.
Yes, I do.
It's been sitting here with us,
Yeah.
and the symbol has been long associated with Sports for Good. Bob, why is this thing here? Tell me something about it.
Well, it's related to our discussion. What's going on in Kenyan football?
Apart from what it looks like, why do you have the Laurea Sports for Good Award?
I of all the trophies, I thought this was the one that most represents MISA, as because we've always been, I hope, in the Mathare slums and elsewhere, a force for good, and so we were, not coincidentally, we were the first project that Laureus took up in the year 2000, and we were the first to get the Laureus Sport for Good
Wow.
award in 2004. And not coincidentally, the same year we were among the finalists for the top 10 in the Nobel Peace Prize.
Yeah.
For the work that has been done in Mathare. Now, that brings me back to just the alumni. There seems to be a Mathare United, a Mathare Youth Sports Association alumni at every corner of the world.
Yes.
Do you keep tabs on them? Do you know what they're doing?
Oh yes. In fact, this year we're actually utilizing this period of no activities to refocus on now registering and mobilizing the MISA alumni around the world, in Kenya and around the world. So, and we hope by the end of the year to have at least 5,000 to 10,000 registered alumni, and then next year 20 to 30, and sooner the better, because first of all they to link them up with each other. You know, what's so and so doing? I haven't seen them for 5 years or 10 years. Also to provide a mutual network of support to each other when they get into difficulties. Then they can just go through the alumni list, and if you're a lawyer and you've hit this problem and you see which alumni or lawyers, give me a call and say, hey, listen, I've got this legal issue and I don't want to discuss it with, you know, there's all kinds of things we can do. We also want them to provide mentorship to the 30,000 youth who are still active in MISA on our 1,900 teams in 16 zones. You know, they've helped break the ceiling, because before MISA, the only role models they had were ones with money, and they didn't get it exactly in the proper way. But now, you know, lawyers and doctors, and they're everywhere. They're everywhere, including in FKF.
Yes, it's true.
Yes,
actually, let's talk about that, including in KPL. Don't you
Yes.
have alumni in KPL as
Yeah,
well?
of course, the
So
CEO.
the famous question, why can't we just live happily, comes up again.
Exactly.
Why can't they
exactly.
sit together?
Yes, well, maybe MISA will be the mediator.
I want to bring you back to this football here, the one that is called Juala. It's made out of polythene paper, which has been banned in the
Yes.
country, and I think this is, we call it Manila string, you know, very tight string as well. and a lot of players started from this. But I understand because of the alumni of MISA, there's a bigger story on this Juala football. What is that story?
What I like about it as well, and the way the youth make them, is that it's also a world, you know, lines of longitude, lines of latitude.
Globe,
it's a globe. It's a world.
Yes.
You know, all of its own. Yes, we had back in 2009. You're looking at the most expensive football in the world.
What, polythene paper and Manila strings?
Yes.
Yeah.
How can that be expensive? It wouldn't cost you $1.
One of our staff members was on a secondment to a radio station in Werder in Bremen, and that was arranged by Willy Lemke, who was then the advisor to the UN Secretary General on Sport for Development and a friend of MISA. So he was there and he made this and he gave it to Willy. Willy then went to New York and gave it to the Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, who then, several months later, was in Copenhagen in October 2009, was in Copenhagen at the International Olympic Congress. And there's this lovely photo of him holding up this made in Mathare Juala ball and talking about sport for development and sport for peace, using mice as an example, but the ball as an example. Then he gave it to the head of the IOC, Jacques Roga, who then gave it to Princess Haya, who took it back to the Gulf and put it in an auction for aiding Palestinian children. And they had Roger Federer shirts, Venus Williams, they had a Chelsea shirt signed by all the players, and guess which got the highest bid at $205,000 was this Juala ball.
What?
That's 20 million shillings. That sold for 20 million shillings. The guy who bought it gave it back to Jacques Roga, who took it back to Lausanne, and that Juala ball is in the Olympic Museum in Lausanne in a special case. So 20 million, but you guys are friends. You can have one for half price. And
I think that's the point at which we end it. When it starts costing too much
my
for
club
us.
needs it.
Half of it is 10 million shillings
yes.
for a Juala football.
It's amazing.
We're not even thinking about it. We're just happy that it was able to raise that much money. Bob, thank you very much for talking to us. Unless it's something you really feel you should add at the moment, I think we've tried to exploit literally what we can of this interview on Kenyan football.
I want to thank both of you for your really sharp questions and for encouraging me to open up on these, because as you know, I don't like publicity and I don't need it and I don't like it. But from time to time, you have to speak out, and especially when so many players and their families, good young men trying to get out of poverty through football, and their dreams have been shattered by mismanagement and by COVID.
Well, sadly, COVID has triggered a lot of other things and has found us in that transitional situation as well, and with an election coming up as well. So this has compounded a lot of things. But again, we thank you very much for what you have said. And like I said, I haven't had that tone, the conciliatory tone, for a long time.
I've always been there.
You've always been there, yes, but you've never had to use it that much, and especially on television, you know, to be able to bring people together. So I think you're watching this and listening to this, you could heed that voice and please go to the table and discuss whatever needs to be done in football. But we have to end it there for now. We have been talking about Kenyan football, funding, COVID, and how it has affected it. Like I told you, this is Bonga Futaa. It goes behind to find out exactly what's going on in the world of soccer, and we hope that then it spurs other people to sit down and talk about what needs to be done in soccer in Kenya so that we can move forward. Jacob Gosmale has been my co-host, and Bob Munro, of course, you know him, founder of MISA, and of course has been there for Mathare United and the Kenyan Premier League as well. He's shed a lot of light on what he thinks should happen, should not happen in the state of soccer in Kenya. I'm Bernardo Tieno. Thank you for now. We'll meet you again next week for another in-depth discussion on Kenyan soccer. Goodbye.